Hi, I'm Kyle, and in this section we're going to talk about natural language and directed dialogues. Now, the idea about natural language is the idea of allowing the caller to speak in a more natural fashion. Now, this is not exactly contrary to directed dialogue, but typically it carries some preconceptions about what you can do with the technology. Now, a directed dialogue is just the idea that you're going to ask a series of questions to the caller, going from one piece of information to the next until you have enough to have your caller reach their goal of, again, the idea of routing the caller to an appropriate person, providing them with information, or possibly completing a transaction. Now, with natural language, you'll find that the complexity depends greatly upon the scope of your natural language interaction. Now, there's, to give you two extremes, there's one, on one side you have the idea of how may I help you. On the other side you have, let's say, a currency interaction where you're going to head and ask a person for a dollar amount. Now, both are kind of examples of natural language, right? In one hand, the person's going to tell you how they need to be helped, and on the other side, the person's saying 4,745. Both of them are allowing the caller to respond in a natural fashion, but each one is much more complex than the other. And in fact, what ends up happening, and the way you can evaluate this, is the predictability of the question you're asking decreases the complexity of what you're asking. And in fact, that's the kind of key idea here. For natural language to work with traditional speech technologies, you have to predict everything that the caller may say. Not what they might talk about, but what they're actually going to say. Now, this ends up making natural language to be a very cost-prohibitive process, whether using the alternate technology, which effectively costs hundreds of thousands of dollars, multiple hundreds of thousands of dollars, and a long development time, which ends up being a very fragile application at the end anyway. Now, let's talk a little bit about directed dialogues. Now, directed dialogues, this is going to be your standard tool. Even if you were to utilize natural language, for most of your transactions, you're still in a more traditional directed dialogue state. Now, this is the idea that each question will gather one piece of information and then move on and progress the call to the next one. And with this, you'll achieve, again, your goals. Now, we'll be doing this with prompts, with grammars, and the prompts and grammars set up the transaction. Right? The prompt is going to have the caller, we're going to basically tell the caller what we're expecting them to say or provide to us. The callers are going to provide that to us, and that will be represented in the grammar. And then after that, we have our application logic, because speech recognition isn't artificial intelligence. For every response the caller may give us, we need to have programmed in the appropriate actions so that the caller feels that we're taking care of them in an appropriate fashion. And that's, in effect, our supporting transactions. Now, there are some that we have to take care of. They're similar to touch tone or IVR applications, which are, we didn't understand what they said, right? If a person pushed the wrong button on a touch tone application, we would have to say that was an invalid response. With speech, we do the same kind of an idea, but it's in a little more natural fashion. Since we're asking questions of the caller, the caller may say something that we weren't expecting or we didn't understand them, and then we'll come back with, I'm sorry, I didn't quite get that. Can you please repeat yourself? Under confirmations, this is the idea of we weren't so sure what they said. So we're pretty sure they said main menu, but to be sure, you might want to confirm it, and that's what the ASR engine will tell you. You, as the application developer at that point, will then confirm that the caller actually wants to go to the main menu. And again, the idea that for every response the caller makes that we decide this is what they said, you have to have application logic to support it. So let's go ahead and talk a little bit about dialogue complexity. And we'll take our city-state example. Now, I may have an application that says, please tell me the city and state you'll be traveling to. And the caller could respond with San Diego, California. Now, this is not too bad of an application dialogue, right? It's pretty simple. I'm going to have one grammar with all of my city and states in it, and then I'm going to have a prompt that's simply going to address the caller. Now, I'm done, right? Well, what happens if the caller says just a state? And in fact, I've had cases where the stakeholder says, well, I want you to be able to handle it if they just say a state. That should be a valid response. I go, okay, well, if we just allow them to say the state, then that means I need to make 50, or I need to be able to generate 50 different grammars based on if they say a state California, then I want a grammar with just the cities in California. And then I need to make prompts, 50 different prompts that will say, well, for California, which state do you want in California? And then they'll go ahead, or what city do you want in California? And they'll say the cities. So now I've just kind of added a layer of complexity to it. Additionally, then the stakeholder can come back and say, well, if they just say the city, that should work too, because a lot of times there's just one city in a state. And if there's more than one city represented, such like Springfield, then you'll go ahead and just ask them what state they want. Now, at this point, I've taken an application dialogue that initially took me less than a day to create, and I turned it into a week-long or 2-week-long project. In this way, we can see how all of a sudden a dialogue, through allowing for some natural language, for its complexity to increase greatly. And this is why I try to caution people, let's go ahead and take care of the 90 or 95% of the people that will actually respond in a correct fashion, as opposed to devoting, say, 2 weeks worth of work to the 5%, which may or may not say the state only. And in fact, this is another idea where how many people would actually only say a city or would only say a state? And you don't know that until the application is actually released. You may find that only, say, 3% of the people only say a city or only say a state. Now all of a sudden you've increased your development time by 400 or 500% to service 3% of the people who you would just have to reprompt to get them to say the right thing. So these are some guidelines, general guidelines in designing your application, as well as to try to help you keep your focus on the amount of scope work that you want to do. The next couple of, the next presentation I'll be talking about prompts, and the one after that, grammars. Thank you very much.